Oui, 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 le Outlander, exactement. Puis tout de suite, là, le Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV a eu des modifications pour 2026. Mais pour 2026, Nissan a emprunté la technologie du Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV, mais celle du 2025.
Quelle est la différence?
Quelle est la différence? On va commencer par ça. Écoute, physiquement, là, essentiellement la même affaire. On a changé le portier de calandre en avant, le super truck, aussi les feux arrière sont dorénavant fumés. Mais autrement, physiquement, tu as le même véhicule, un design de jantes aussi là, qui est différent. Effectivement, c'est le même véhicule de l'extérieur. À l'intérieur, des nouvelles couleurs pour les sièges, un écran de 12,3 pouces de série sur toutes les variantes, mais on garde pas mal la même affaire. La petite troisième rangée est encore là que vous aimez tant dans le Mitsubishi Outlander. Et c'est au niveau technique. Le moteur demeure le même, 2,4 litres. Avec le rouage intégral, les deux moteurs électriques, etc. C'est la batterie qui change. On avait une batterie de 20 kWh, on a maintenant une batterie de 22,7 kWh. Alors, ça augmente, on était à 61 km d'autonomie tout électrique jusqu'à 72 km d'autonomie tout électrique. Jusque-là, la technologie de la batterie, c'était une vieille batterie qu'on avait avant dans ce véhicule-là. Donc, on a changé.
Elle était neuve quand même.
Elle était neuve quand on l'achetait. Mais elle a subi, on va dire, elle a bénéficié de toutes les améliorations qui ont été assez régulières là, dans les dernières années.
Ouais.
Des nouvelles cellules, un meilleur refroidissement, un meilleur output, là, une meilleure sortie, qui lui permet de garder sommairement le même poids, mais qu'on a une meilleure puissance. Écoute, dans le Nissan Rogue PHEV, on garde toute la technologie de l'ancien 2025, qui est somme toute une bonne technologie, mais on lui reprochait certains petits défauts, dont celle d'avoir une autonomie tout électrique qui était correcte, mais 60 km, ça semble un petit peu bas dans la compétition de la Compact. Puis aussi le fait qu'il était pas mal plus gourmand quand cette batterie-là était parce que c'est un véhicule qu'on consommait un peu plus que ouais, je ne me rappelle pas, là, avec cette autonomie, avec le moteur à essence. Donc, si les études disent vrai, que les gens achètent des véhicules hybrides rechargeables, des branches pas, ça devient un véhicule à essence plein de véhicules électriques et une batterie. Et branchez le titre de mon article pour lequel de c'est branchez-le parce qu'on parle de le brancher comme tous les utilitaires ou tous les véhicules hybrides rechargeables.
Attention, sinon, tu achètes un Outlander avec un capacité de 1,5 litres turbo qui vient de sortir.
C'est ça, tu ne payes pas le prix puis non pas la subvention, ça sert à rien. Ouais, au cours de l'essai, on a été capable de faire 63 km en autonomie tout électrique si j'avais été capable de faire probablement 50 km avec l'ancien modèle. On voit qu'il y a une amélioration. L'amélioration, j'ai trouvé qu'elle est dans la conduite, dans le sens parce que le moteur électrique, grâce à sa nouvelle batterie, peut rester plus longtemps dans les accélérations. Ça te fait une conduite qui est un petit peu plus électrique, véhicule électrique, et puis plus fluide, plus linéaire et moins bruyante. On reprochait un peu au PHEV, même au PHEV d'être un petit peu bruyant quand on le sollicite. On a amélioré certaines au niveau de l'autonomisation à l'intérieur, je ne l'ai pas dit, mais on a amélioré ça. Mais dans l'opération du moteur, c'est plus linéaire, c'est plus facile et on garde une motorisation électrique beaucoup plus longtemps. Donc, ceci, ça permet d'avoir une meilleure conduite, selon moi, mais aussi avoir une meilleure consommation après, là, parce que le moteur électrique continue toujours à embarquer, on récupère de l'énergie, on va reprendre dans les accélérations. Alors, avec la nouvelle batterie, on a été capable de garder l'influence de ce moteur-là un petit peu plus longtemps, et puis on est arrivé à aller chercher, je pense, 8,6 litres au 100 km. C'est pas après, une fois que c'est 3,2, là, en tout et partout, mais 8,6, une fois que la batterie est épuisée, c'est une amélioration. C'est pas écœurant, comme tu regardes c'est ça. Oui, mais on améliore certains points qu'on est capable de faire sur ce véhicule-là, puis je trouve qu'on le regarde un peu dans le fond.
Mais à quel point, là, je te pose une question qui est un peu piège, là. À quel point c'est...
Y a-t-il une question que tu poses des fois qui n'est pas piège?
Oui, c'est que je trouve ça fascinant parce qu'en ce moment, il reste des Outlander PHEV de 2025 en stock. On les liquide aux il y a de sacrés bons deals là-dessus. Et l'autre qui est financé à 6,49. L'autre revient plus cher qu'un RAV4.
Ouais.
Ben, le RAV4 qui va arriver de façon... Parce qu'on a baissé les prix des RAV4 PHEV par rapport à la précédente génération.
C'est intéressant.
Alors là, tu vois l'écart se rétrécir au point où, dans certains cas, si tu compares l'Outlander et le RAV4, l'Outlander revient même un peu plus cher.
Ouais.
Ça commence à être un petit peu difficile, là, je trouve.
Ouais.
Bon, Nissan, on n'est pas dedans parce que le Rogue PHEV coûte le prix d'un Outlander 26 sans offrir la technologie.
Et ici, qui prouve d'ailleurs la facture. C'est une question qui revient tout le temps.
Ouais.
Je trouve que j'ai un peu. Il va
Mais le D, là, en ce moment, il est sur des PHEV à 0%, admissible à la petite subvention de 2000 $. Ben, regarde, ça fait quand même.
Techniquement, l'amélioration elle est très bonne dans le 2026. Il va être intéressant, ce véhicule-là. C'est juste que là, avec ces taux-là, là, c'est très intéressant. Dans les deux cas, chez eux, c'est ça. C'est tout d'avoir un véhicule comme ça. Ah oui, toi, je oui, évidemment. Jeep Cherokee de ton côté, c'est complètement différent.
Je le conduis cette semaine. Alors, il y a un moteur 1.6 litres turbo là-dedans d'origine Peugeot. Visiblement, on amène du stock de France, hein? Et des gens aussi, mais ça, c'est un autre histoire. Et ce Jeep-là, honnêtement, fait tout le travail qu'on lui demande. Moi, c'est ce que je retiens, c'est que les gens chez Stellantis, ils ont fait des focus group, ils ont posé des questions à des propriétaires de CRV, de RAV4, de tout ça, de Ford Escape, de tout ce que tu veux. C'est clair qu'ils ont dessiné ce véhicule-là basé sur des données statistiques qu'ils ont reçues. Parce que ça répond à tout ce que les gens veulent avoir. Le belle gueule est bien assis, l'équipement est généreux, la technologie à l'intérieur est unique. Ça consomme évidemment moins parce que c'est un hybride, on va y revenir. Il y a une puissance qui est adéquate, ça tire 3500 livres. Tu sais, ça fait tout bien. Puis parce que c'est un Jeep, tu as une garde au sol de 8 pouces, des encadrants de sortie qui sont plus intéressants que la moyenne des autres.
Il est nord-américanisé dans l'esprit aventurier.
Il n'y a pas de version trademark. Ça, je le comprends pas encore. Ça va peut-être arriver pour 2025. Et il y a une seule motorisation hybride de série. Alors, dans ce créneau-là, souvent, tu vas avoir 2 ou 3 offres mécaniques. Chez Jeep, on n'en a pas une seule, mais c'est la bonne. C'est une motorisation hybride qui travaille un peu de la même façon que celle du Honda CR-V. C'est-à-dire que tu as le moteur à essence et un moteur électrique, l'assistant, qui va aussi servir de démarreur. Au demeurant. Et tu as le deuxième moteur électrique qui, lui, sert à acheminer la puissance au roues et à réalimenter la batterie de 1,02 kW. Alors, tout ça, ça te permet d'aller chercher en puissance maximale combinée 210 chevaux. Fait que tu vois, on est pile poil dans ce que propose la compétition. Ça a beaucoup de couple. Hein. C'est plus de 250 livres de couple. Là. Je ne me souviens pas du chiffre par cœur, mais tu peux rouler facilement en mode électrique sans que ce soit pénible ou que tu doives conduire avec un œuf sous la pédale. Alors ça, j'ai trouvé ça intéressant. Et la transition entre l'électrique et le moteur à essence se fait de façon très linéaire. Tu sais, on a souvent critiqué certains modèles pour leur manque de raffinement. Si vous pensez que c'est un peu mieux qu'un Compass, c'est ça, on est ailleurs complètement. Moi, j'ai beaucoup aimé la conduite, l'aménagement. Puis je me suis mis au volant en me disant, j'aime-tu mieux ça qu'un RAV4, qu'un CR-V? Ça n'a rien à envier à ce produit. C'est sûr que... Puis même côté qualité de construction, pas grand-chose à dire. Ouais. Oui, il y a des petits glitches de finition à gauche, à droite, mais tu es assis dans un RAV4, c'est pas comme si c'était merveilleux non plus. Fait que, on a... Bon, il y a deux affaires. Un, ça consomme plus qu'un. Parce que tu vois, on a beau annoncer une cote moyenne combinée à 6,4 litres au 100. Après 460 km de parcouru avec le véhicule, ma moyenne est à 7,6.
OK, oui, quand même. Hein?
7,6 pour un hybride. OK, on est autour du point de congélation. Il y a une journée où il ventait beaucoup quand je l'ai roulé. On va faire un peu mieux là d'ici quelques semaines, quelques mois. OK, parfait. Mais tu n'as pas le rendement énergétique d'un Toyota RAV4. Fait que celui qui veut acheter un hybride pour avoir le meilleur rendement énergétique et que c'est la priorité numéro 1, pas le bon produit. Compare ça à l'ancienne Cherokee, c'est un pas de géant. Puis c'est une mécanique qui est vraiment convaincante. Là-dessus, ça va. Mais si tu compares ça avec ce qui existe hybride sur le marché en ce moment, chez Honda, chez Hyundai, je te dirais plus qu'on est dans le territoire de consommation du Subaru Forester. Okay? On est vraiment là-dedans. C'est quand même très bien, là, ça ne consomme pas. Mais face aux autres hybrides, un petit peu plus. Et puis l'autre truc, ben ça, c'est une inquiétude personnelle. Est-ce que ça va être fiable?
C'est ça, moi, ça va être ma question.
C'est ça. Parce qu'évidemment, c'est un moteur qu'on connaît, qui ne semble pas avoir eu beaucoup de problèmes du côté de l'Europe. On l'a jumelé à une boîte, on l'appelle... C'est pas une boîte CVT, c'est un direct drive en réalité. Une transmission à proprement parler, mais il faut que tout ça fonctionne et soit fiable. Et si on réussit à offrir un certain niveau de fiabilité chez Jeep avec ce produit-là, ben là, on va réussir à regagner la confiance du public, les séduire à nouveau parce qu'il y en a beaucoup qui sont partis. Il y a eu des histoires cauchemardesques avec la technologie 4XE au cours des dernières années. Il y a tout cet exercice-là qui est hyper important. Je pense que l'approche de Jeep est très bonne. Le fait qu'on utilise la plateforme STLA large, ça ouvre la porte à mettre des moteurs à essence traditionnels sans hybridation. Ça ouvre aussi la porte à de l'électrique. Alors, qui sait ce qui va arriver pour l'avenir? Mais on cible la clientèle nord-américaine de belle façon avec la bonne mécanique, la bonne formule. Puis côté prix, je vais terminer avec ça. Tu vois, on est dans, là, grosso modo, là, 42 à 58 000 $. On est pile poil dans les prix de la compétition. Mais c'est tout ce qui est drôle. Stellantis nous a toujours habitués à avoir des prix super hauts puis mettre des gros prix. C'est pas ça qu'on fait. Là, le PDSF est compétitif. Ils ont amalgamé avec celui de la compétition. Mais il n'y a pas de rabais. Avec des taux qui sont corrects. Au financement, avec un taux qui est correct, là, qui est à 4,9 pour le moment. On vient de le lancer sur le marché. En location, taux à 8,09 J'ai fait le comparatif. Là. L'équipement pour équipement versus un RAV4, ça coûte 100 $ de plus par mois du bois de Cherokee. Et ça, tu sais, SCI, qui est la boîte qui gère le financement du côté de chez Stellantis, faut retourner dans les calculatrices puis être un peu plus compétitif. Parce que pour le moment, ça n'a aucun bon sens. Et ça m'amène à te dire aussi qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui se procurent ce genre de véhicule-là qui veulent louer.
Oui, mais en fait, c'est ça, parce que ce que tu sembles dire, c'est que son plus gros défaut, finalement, c'est son mode de financement.
C'est son plus gros défaut? Ben, d'abord, il faut voir une chose.
Mais c'est moi parce que là, c'est vraiment... C'est comme ils ont fait 95% de la job, puis à la fin...
Ben, tu as absolument raison, parce que l'autre truc, et je peux revenir sur la fiabilité, c'est que toi, je ne serais pas prêt au jour 1 à acheter ça les yeux fermés en disant je vais le garder 8 ans.
Les gens vont vouloir essayer. Là, on va le remettre, ça va faire, on va en prendre un autre.
Il faut attirer les gens, là, c'est maintenant qu'il faut les attirer.
Le commitment de dire je l'achète à 100% est beaucoup plus grand que de dire je vais le louer sur 3 ou 4 ans.
Bien sûr.
Et comme tu ne m'as pas encore fait la preuve que c'était fiable et qu'on était capable de faire face à la musique chez Stellantis, regarde une petite gêne. Moi, c'est le truc qui. C'est pas le véhicule en tant que tel, c'est la façon de le vendre.
C'est quand même dommage.
Puis ça, va falloir régler le problème et rapidement. Alors, merci tout le monde d'avoir été là.
Bonne semaine à tous.
Tous les épisodes du Livre sont disponibles en votre application électrique.
Préparez vos passeports en direction de Casino de Montréal pour la promotion du gagnant. Tous les dimanches, du 22 février au 22 mars, pour la chance de remporter un voyage, dont de gros lots de 10 000 $ pour réaliser le voyage de vos rêves. Et les lundis soirs de mars, assistez au spectacle de Juste pour rire Comedy Club en tournée. Remplissez la grisaille et laissez-vous transporter au Casino de Montréal. 18 ans ou plus.
Les travailleurs et employeurs canadiens ont bâti notre pays. Leurs forces et ténacité ont façonné le Canada d'aujourd'hui. Si vous traversez cette période d'incertitude, sachez que vous n'êtes pas seul. Le gouvernement du Canada est là pour vous soutenir grâce à des mesures incluant de formation, de l'aide financière pour prévenir les mises à pied, des outils de recherche d'emploi et des prestations d'assurance emploi souples. Découvrez le soutien offert aux Canadiens touchés par les droits de douane au canada.ca/droits de douane. Un message du gouvernement du Canada. Et là, pour vous soutenir, des mesures incluant de la formation, de l'aide financière pour prévenir les mises à pied, des outils de recherche d'emploi et des prestations d'assurance emploi souples. Découvrez le soutien offert aux Canadiens touchés par les droits de douane à canada.ca/droits de douane. Un message du gouvernement du Canada.
Un sentier, une forêt, un arbre, un oiseau, un autre arbre, plein d'arbres, un ruisseau, une pente, un étang, une clôture à vaches, une coupe, une plaque de glace, un dérapage, une roche, un impact, un vol plané, un tonneau, 2 tonneaux, 3 tonneaux, un accident mortel à motoneige. Garde ta passion en vie. Quand tu testes les limites, tu n'es plus en contrôle. Un message du gouvernement du Québec.
Solité automobile. Faites le tour. Sauvé. C'est le pied de l'épaule. La route est la 137. Le pied de l'épaule.
Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue au Guide de l'auto en compagnie de mes fidèles comparses Hugues Gonneau, Louis-Philippe Dubé. Messieurs, bonjour.
Salut!
Tu vas nous parler d'un beau véhicule classique aujourd'hui
Oui.
dans ta chronique vintage. J'ai très hâte de parler ça. Ça sera le moment stellantis de la journée. Et on va commencer tout de suite avec une grosse nouvelle qui est arrivée du côté de chez Honda, qui a probablement fait rager beaucoup d'employés d'ailleurs, parce que c'est une nouvelle qui est un peu, sans vouloir faire de mauvais jeu de mots, qui est à contre-courant.
Oh,
Hein?
oui.
Allons-y comme ça.
Allons-y comme ça.
Alors, Honda qui abandonne ces 3 véhicules électriques qui devaient être commercialisés dans les 12 à 18
Yeah, more sleep is associated with a decreased mortality rate. So the better we sleep, the happier and healthier we are. And as we're all too familiar with, shift work disturbs our wonderful sleep because shift work messes with our circadian rhythms and our sleep drive. And messing with our circadian rhythms and our sleep drive is not trivial. Besides all the long-term badness, our chance of being involved in an MVC on our commute home is much higher when our circadian rhythm is messed with. I'm embarrassed to admit that I snatched up my car on my commute home after an overnight shift. But since then, I've learned a few things about sleep, and I think it's made me healthier and happier. Yet, I still feel I need up sleep strategies to the best that they can be. And I have so many questions about how best to optimize sleep for shift work. So I invited a sleep expert to give us some evidence-based answers to some practical questions and give us some solutions so that we can sleep better and live better. Dr. Michael Mack is a sleep medicine specialist and staff psychiatrist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. He's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and an adjunct research professor at Boston University. He has a passion for medical education, winning multiple teaching awards. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Welcome to the Emergency Medicine Cases podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anton Hellman, bringing you the brightest minds in emergency medicine from around the world. In Cases is brought to you by SHREMI, the Schwartz Reisman Emergency Medicine Institute. That's a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving EM care through high-quality research and education. The opinions expressed on this podcast intended for medical purposes only. They may be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should they be used as substitute for medical advice from qualified office physicians.
First, just a quick word from reports from Metricade, experts in complex physician scheduling since 2012. I've been using Metricade's incredible scheduling system for more than a decade, and it's been a game changer for me and my colleagues. Shift work comes with its challenges, but Metricade helps minimize the drawbacks by ensuring fair distribution of shifts while integrating circadian rhythm-friendly recovery time into its methodology, preserving your precious sleep so that you can perform at your best. Go to metricade.com/EMcases.
The app has drug dosing, equipment size calculation, treatment algorithms, all in under 3 clicks. Rapid access to life-saving critical info and a user for Dr. Mack.
Thank you for having me.
All right, before we dive in, Mike, do you have any financial conflicts of interest, like with sleep medications or anything like that?
Yeah, and they're as follows. I receive unrestricted educational funds from Paladin, Eastside, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, ResMed, to fund our sleep medicine fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Because right now, apparently, it's a faux pas to allow people to self-fund, i.e. work shifts in psychiatric emerge or the outpatient clinic, and to fund your way through the fellowship, you have to give them your salary. I received Speaker Bureau from Eastside, Dorset, and Paladin. I've done consulting with Jazz, Eastside, Dorset, and I'm a shareholder of Eli Lilly.
All right, great. So we're not going to get into any details about any sleep medications, but there are a lot of other topics to cover for making our sleep better. And so let's dive into a deeper understanding of how sleep affects our performance on shift and get some practical sleep hygiene principles and strategies based on the science that's out there. So first, I think before we dive into the sleep hygiene principles and strategies for shift work, I think we need to understand a little bit about the physiology of sleep to help inform those strategies. So can you just give us sort of an overview of the physiology of sleep related to good sleep hygiene and shift work?
Yeah, that's a great place to start off. Well, there are two processes that drive sleep. So the first one would be process S, which is sleep homeostasis. We've all had the experience of working 24-hour shifts, and you'll know that that version of yourself that's been up for 24 hours is necessarily sleepier than the version of yourself that only did, let's say, an 8-hour shift. And that's because the longer period you're up for, the greater amounts of adenosine build up in your brain. And that is what drives that sleep homeostasis. The longer you're up for, the sleepier you become. So that's process S. Process C is the circadian process. And that's regulated by the light-dark cycle of the external environment, which feeds into receptors in our eyes, outside of rods and cones for light and color. There's also a third set of receptors in the retina. These receptors have melanopsin. They're called melanopsin receptors, and essentially they respond to light exposure from the sun and from artificial lighting since the dawn of that. And basically, there are times where it makes sense to be sleeping. There are times that makes sense for us to be more awake and more. In general terms, when the sun is out, we're going to be the most alert we can be. And when the sun starts to set, that sets up the stage for our internal body clock to tell us to become sleepier. So that's the two processes that drive sleep. Process that's process. The two processes together, the net outcome is what we see lately. Most people end up sleeping 7 to 9 hours if you're an adult. If you're 65 and above, you sleep 7 to 8 hours. Most of us become sleepy or start becoming sleepy 2 or 3 hours after the sun goes down, and you wake up when the sun comes up the next day.
All right, so essentially you've got your circadian rhythm, which is sort of the clock, and then sleep drive is the adenosine buildup. What about cortisol? Because that's driving our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. How does that play into sleep?
Yeah. What we see is that a person's cortisol levels peak in the early morning. And they actually peak just maybe the 30 to 45 minutes after the person wakes up. And then thereafter, the cortisol levels slowly decrease, down to basically a low before you go back to sleep again. The surge of cortisol that occurs in the morning is a means for your brain and body to prepare itself for any sort of obligations or stressful things that you have to deal with during the daytime. So I would say that the cortisol is a driver of sleep, but it's a consequence of what you have to do in terms of sleep and wake life obligation.
Right. So I think listeners will see how some of these pathophysiologic mechanisms will come into play big time when we start talking about strategies. I want to move on to basic sleep hygiene principles. So what do I mean by this? So, more sleep during sleep. Some of the things I want to cover here are the timing of sleep, lighting and screen use before sleep, eating, drinking, alcohol, noise, ambient temperature during sleep and when you wake up, wind down routines, and of course caffeine. So let's start with timing of sleep. So basic sleep hygiene principles that I learned when I was in medical school said that you should go to bed at the same time every night and wake up at the same time every morning. I don't know if that's still true because my medical school was a long time ago. In terms of timing of sleep, first of all, how much sleep is ideal? What time should we really fall asleep and what time should we really wake up? And should we use an alarm clock to wake up at the same time every morning? time of sleep.
Yeah, let's talk about duration. You mentioned duration first. So the younger you are, the longer your sleep duration is required. Purposes of growth. Now, for adults, let's say age 18 to 64, then the recommended sleep duration is about 7 to 9 hours. But that's going to be a bell curve. You're going to have lots of folks on the left side of that bell curve, lots of folks on the right side of the bell curve. And part of that is most of that's going to be set genetically. The other half will be behavioral things like, if you're working in emergency medicine, then your obligations take precedence. You'll force yourself to maybe attenuate, maybe shorten your sleep duration compared to what is recommended. But for most folks, it means they need to sleep 7 to 9 hours to feel refreshed, to have the fully restorative properties of sleep to engage. In terms of timing, waking up every day at the same time is the best advice that we can give anybody as it pertains to sleep hygiene and healthy sleep principles in general. Because your awake time is a proxy for your first bright light exposure, sunlight exposure, artificial light exposure. And that's what actually allows your internal body clock to set the start of the next 24-hour cycle. It's important to regularly receive light exposure first thing upon awakening and to keep that consistent. Because our internal body clock, the circadian duration, is actually longer than 24 hours. Some people think it's 24.17 hours. Other people think it's 24.3 hours. Long story short, without sign givers, which are external stimuli that allow our internal body clock to entrain with the light-dark cycle external environment, of which the most powerful stimuli is light. If we didn't have these light givers, we would sleep later and wake up later, progressively speaking, such that the person would be upside down if they didn't receive external stimuli to train their internal body clock. So waking up every day at the same time in the morning is crucial, so that it reduces any sort of social jet lag and minimizes the health concerns with having a mismatch between your internal body clock and the external environment. Your sleep time, though, I'll just make a modification. Your sleep time can be any time. It doesn't have to be the same time, night on night. It really is dictated by when you feel sleepy. When I say, it's dictated by, when you feel sleepy, it's that head nodding sensation that we get. If we've been in a meeting for 45, 46 minutes and you look around sometimes, people have that head nodding feeling. And that's in contrast to fatigue. Fatigue is a body sensation. It feels like, you've done a 12-hour shift, you went to the gym thereafter, your body feels broken. You don't want to stand up. You want to sit on the couch and just watch television. So that's a physical feeling as opposed to sleepiness, which is that head nodding, irresistible sleepiness kind of feeling. It's hard to keep your eyelids open. That's the type of feeling that's dictated when you go to sleep. Because that time's going to be different from night to night, depending on what you did during the day. So you have a long shift and then you get gym for a long period, it's going to be strenuous. You might feel sleepy earlier on those nights compared to days when you were just totally relaxed. So if you force yourself to sleep at the same time night to night, it's a recipe for insomnia. Because on those nights where you're not as sleepy, you're going to give up until you feel that head nodding feeling. That's going to extend artificially.
Ideally, we want to wake up at the same time every morning and get exposed to some good light, whether that's artificial or not, every morning. And then we should go to bed when that head nod, eyelid close feeling happens, no matter what the time is. That's our ideal situation. We'll talk a little bit later about to modify that for shift work. But, that's good to understand. All right, I want to talk about preparing for sleep. So what should we be doing before sleep so that our sleep architecture is the best that it can be? In a past podcast, we talked about diet and sleep. We'll talk about in previously Quick Kids podcast, but I think it's worth exploring here. What kinds of foods should we or should not eat? How long before we go to sleep should we eat? And we'll talk about doing some caffeine and stuff before sleep. But let's start with preparing for sleep in general and what kinds of foods we should and shouldn't eat in the time of the day.
In terms of preparing oneself and optimizing yourself for the best sleep possible, what you're going to want to do is to have a consistent nighttime wind down routine that you keep consistent from night to night. So for most folks, there's going to be some sort of ritual that you do before you go to sleep. That can include grooming, taking a shower, or taking a bath. What we want a person to do is to do those things, those very soothing wind down activities. We want them to do those things, but we don't want a person to do things that increase one's mental or physical arousal. So, working out and exercising is great for health and sleep health in general, but you don't want to do that too close to your bedtime. So we would advise folks to avoid strenuous exercise, let's say least 3 hours before their bedtime, because otherwise it's going to take a long time for your autonomic system to go back to rest. Other things that you don't want a person to do would be to do things that are too engaging. So I know a lot of us like to read before we go to sleep. And maybe for the people that are genetically blessed, they're blessed against the possibility of insomnia and sleep disturbance. That might be fine for them. But, for those of us who are more sensitive to sleep disturbance and shift work changes, then probably you don't want to go to sleep. Read an interesting book or anything before you go to sleep, because then you might actually finish your book, or you might finish your magazine before you go to sleep, and that might be an additional 30 to 60 to 90 minutes that you could have otherwise just optimized your sleep. So on the subject of eating, I don't think it's fruitful to focus too much on what kinds of foods that you would prefer to eat at different times of the day, although there's a lot of research actually being done, particularly from our colleagues from Northwestern University in Chicago, looking at optimal times of eating as it relates to sleep, health, and optimization. But the general rule is that you're not going to want to eat a big meal close to your bedtime. Doing so is going to interrupt your sleep. It's going to make it hard for you to fall asleep. So eating consistently and eating healthy foods is always great. But again, not too close to bedtime. And again, I would tell people, try not to have a big meal 3 hours before bedtime.
Okay, great. So no exercise 3 hours before bed, no big meals 3 hours before bed, and if you're going to read something really boring. Yeah, don't read something that's going to get you all excited, and then you're going to keep reading after you get that feeling that your body wants to fall asleep and stay up late just to read. All right, what about liquids, liquids? Let's talk about caffeine, alcohol, and other beverages. So let's start with caffeinated beverages. So I've heard that if you're a slow caffeine metabolizer, that you shouldn't drink even 12 hours before you're going to go to sleep. I've heard 6 hours is a good time before you go to sleep not to drink any caffeine. I have colleagues who drink gallons of coffee every day, and I have others who don't go near it because they get jittery. I prefer matcha myself because that avoids the whole jittery feeling, but it has this added benefit of this kind of calming effect, which is great for a stressful environment like the emergency department. What can you tell us about caffeine, about the timing of drinking caffeine, the amount of caffeine, and how caffeine interacts with our sleep?
You pointed out the different, factors when it comes to caffeine use. Strategically timed and strategic use of caffeine for one's performance and cognition is obviously a great thing, particularly if we're tasked to work when it's dark out and try to sleep when it's light. We're trying to be most alert when it's dark out. We're upside down, with our internal body clock. So that in that situation, that's going to be helpful. But let's talk about caffeine use and optimizing sleep. So we know that caffeine is a wake-promoting substance. The way that it works is it displaces adenosine, and by doing so, artificially provides greater alertness for the duration that's active. So they've done controlled trials looking at how caffeine that's administered at different times of the day affects nighttime sleep. So you're absolutely correct. The minimum cutoff that we would tell people if they're really interested in maximizing, optimizing their nighttime sleep is give yourself a 6-hour leeway between your last caffeinated beverage and your initiation of sleep time. Even then, they were able to see on average people lost 41 minutes of sleep, but it's much better than, let's say, having your last caffeinated beverage within 4 or 3 or 2 hours before your bedtime. And in terms of, let's say, the amount of caffeine one is going to take, for most healthy adults, your milligrams of caffeine might be acceptable. That translates to 4 cups of coffee, and you can split that up as you will. But you're going to want to bias your caffeine intake close to your wake time, at least in the morning or late morning, and give yourself that 6-hour leeway between when you want to go to sleep. You also spoke about people who are sensitive to the effects of caffeine, and theoretically speaking, they might be people who have either slow metabolizers of caffeine. If you're a slow metabolizer, yes, you should probably give yourself that 12-hour window. And you'll know this, growing up, you'll be the person that has, the small tremor when you drink coffee. You get too amped up. It's just uncomfortable. So the timing is key there.
All right. What about when to drink coffee in the morning? So I've also read that you need to let your body wake up for a certain amount of time, an hour and a half, and then drink coffee in order to optimize your ability to concentrate. So, if I try and do work the second I wake up, I'm still kind of all hazy and I can't really get any work done. But if I wait for an hour and a half after I actually wake up to then take the coffee, after that coffee, I am ready to work. Is there literature to back that up?
It does make sense to delay, when you take your first cup of coffee. If you drank your cup of coffee the moment you woke up in the morning, it might not be productive at all because it's, like I mentioned, it works by one part of its action, mode of action is to displace adenosine. And if you are a person that's just woken up, there's barely any adenosine buildup, in which case, that side of alertness promotion is, it's just not there. The other thing is that if we're looking for, let's say, performance enhancement, and even in Olympics, there's cutoffs. There's maximal cutoffs for caffeine in one's blood and urine, above which you're doping. So absorption of caffeine, and let's say it's certain levels, I think they cross the 45 minutes of taking it. You're going to want to time that onset of action with whatever you're doing. Right? If you take it too early, you've had your highest alertness and response time at a time where you didn't need it. So I think it makes sense not to drink it right away, but time it. Everyone's different. Time it so that that that's the perfect timing for you to drink a cup of coffee, but also get going through your day.
Let's move on to another lightweight, and that is alcohol. The newest guidelines suggest that we shouldn't drink any alcohol, but that's kind of the extreme for most of us. I like to crack a cold. Like, I enjoy Bordeaux, dinner. When should we stop drinking alcohol before bedtime?
The general rule that we tell people in terms of the last 10 time for alcohol use, we do tell people to avoid it, like let's say 3 to 4 hours before your bedtime. Alcohol increases GABA activity in the brain, which is the main inhibitory drive of our brain, balancing out the excitatory side that's glutamate based. So I think we've all had the experience. If we have like a beer or a glass of wine with dinner, we might be able to fall asleep quicker for that increased GABA activity. The problem is when our liver breaks down and metabolizes the alcohol, we have the rebound effect. So it interrupts sleep by causing more middle of night awakenings. I think a 3 to 4 hour window before you go to sleep, that's going to be the minimum acceptable window. And then, again, depending on what kind of alcohol you're taking in, the time to metabolize will also be different. And that's the problem with alcohol. It's very unpredictable. Like as compared to other medications that we prescribe that, let's say, mediate GABA activity, then that's more a predictable thing.
All right, so the old nightcap before you go to sleep of a little shot of rye or something is not a good thing for your sleep.
No, you'll never hear anybody say that that's okay.
Okay, kind of similar to alcohol is cannabis. I guess there's cannabis, and then there's just the CBD part of cannabis, which is legal in Canada and a few of the states in the U.S. as well. What does the evidence suggest when it comes to using cannabis or CBD before sleep?
Yeah, well, a lot of work is done into investigating the utility of cannabinoids for the purposes of initiating sleep and sustaining sleep. Basically, a lot of companies, a lot of chemists want to use cannabinoids as a treatment for insomnia and sleep disturbance. So I can tell you that all sorts of different combinations of cannabinoids have been trialed in RCTs for insomnia, whether it's some sort of mix of THC, which is a compound which causes people to feel high when they take it, or cannabidiol, CBD, as you mentioned, and then CBN, cannabinol. So people have tried lots of different mixes and levels of these cannabinoids. And what I can tell you is that they might be able to show positive evidence for reduced sleep latency if it's a short-term trial, let's say 4 to 6 weeks. It can reduce the time it takes for a person to fall asleep, which is sleep latency. But anytime you extend these trials for a longer period, they actually have the opposite effect. They tend to, the person's taking them on a nightly basis, and now it takes them longer to fall asleep. They have more interruptions in the morning. When you look at the sleep architecture as measured by sleep EEG, sleep states, by sonography, what you're going to see is a propensity for more light sleep, a substantial reduction in deep sleep and dream sleep, and it's counterproductive. So you add to that the risk of psychosis, even in people with no genetic propensity for psychosis. And people that take cannabinoids, it's a no-go. So in the latest Delphi consensus treatment suggestions in the Canadian group of which I'm part, we see that cannabinoids are considered for a very narrow segment of sleep disorders, people that sleep issues, there's a game, it's what's up it's a bad idea. And, you know, like we people, it's free folks that have been generally
All right. So very narrow therapeutic indications for CBD, weapons, and other cannabinoids as well.
Let's take a little break to hear from one of our sponsors, Metricade, the expert in complex physician scheduling since 2012. Metricade expert schedulers are their secret sauce. These people truly understand the complexities of physician scheduling. They empower us by providing the tools we need to manage our teams efficiently. At the same time, they give physicians more freedom to share their workflow preferences, so schedules aren't just fair, they're actually workable. Metricade's system is built to make your schedule work for you. They take the stress out of shift planning so that you can focus on what matters most. Go to metricade.com/emcases because smarter scheduling can work for you. That's metricaid, one word, .com/EMCASES. We talked about substances taken to drink or smoke or take prior to falling asleep. I want to talk about light and dark, which, as we mentioned, are sort of the triggers for our circadian rhythms. Rose, can you tell us a bit about what our brains are actually doing when it comes to light and dark affecting our circadian rhythm?
Yeah, like, so I mentioned that there's the melanocytes receptors in our eyes are independent of color. So they receive stimuli by way of light, and the default setting is that if there's light stimuli, then there's an outward inhibitory signal, so it's called VASI-D, which is the Center for Internal Body Clock. It's the Center for the Circadian Rhythm, and it has an inhibitory effect on the secretion of melatonin from the pineal gland. So when your melanocyte receptors that detect a relative lack, a relative decrease in light exposure, i.e. sundown, or historically traditional sundown, then we lose that inhibitory signal to the pineal gland, and that's when the melatonin is secreted. The secretion of melatonin is what controls, when we start to feel sleepy and when we want to wake.
All right, so that's a little bit about how it works in the brain. What about the different kinds of light? Like there's the spectrum of light, which is measured in kelvins. Like a candle light is 1,000 kelvins, whereas daylight is about 4,500 kelvins. How does that spectrum of light, on one end of the spectrum it's yellow and on the other end of the spectrum it's blue, how does that affect our sleep, and what do we need to know about that in terms of going to sleep and waking up?
Yeah, the wavelengths of light, which dictate behavior. So let's say you mentioned warm lighting, which is what we prefer indoors. They tend to be yellower. If you go to Home Depot or some sort of hardware store, you'll have the ability to choose between cold lights and warm lights. The warm lights are the ones that are more desirable for indoor lighting. At hospitals or places where they want us to work, we see more cold lighting. That's more biased towards a blue tinge. So light, as I mentioned, is the strong sign giver for internal body clock. It's what allows us to manipulate our internal body clock, whether in the context of mitigating problems with shift work or jet lag. So it's like this. Warmer lights have less sleep disturbance effects if we're exposed to close to our bedtime, as compared to the very cold blue lighting. The cold blue lighting will have a greater effect on the suprachiasmatic nuclei and delay the onset of concentration once exposure to the same brightness of light but relatively lower kelvins. You mentioned candles, which are very, very low Kelvin rating, and then on the far right, on the opposite end, we're going to have like that blue. So, if you're picking between poison, right? Then the ones that are low Kelvin, the more warmer lights they're less inclined to screw up your nighttime sleep.
Okay, so if you're going to have a bedside lamp, you want it low Kelvin, like 1,000 Kelvin, and then in the morning, conversely, we'll talk a little bit about light therapy and that sort of thing to wake you up in the morning, but in the morning, you'll want more of the blue light.
That's right. The blue lighting in the morning helps nighttime sleep. it's also been demonstrated to improve one's mood, and you'll know that we prescribe those types of lights, those very blue wavelength lights with minimum brightness 10,000 lux in the morning for treatment of seasonal depression.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's say our listeners don't have seasonal affective disorder. Is there value if you live in a climate where it's cloudy and there's not much sunlight out and you're not going outside first thing in the day? Is there value just for people who don't have problems with sleep? Is there value in exposing yourself to bright blue light in the morning?
In the absence of pathology, exposing yourself to that kind of light in the morning is not going to hurt you. And if you're a relatively younger person, let's say you're like a teenager up to the age of 24, these people have a tendency to sleep late and wake up late by sheer force of genetics. We've all had that. We all go through that process. And then after like, let's say age 24, we all have physiologic phase advance. The older we get, year by year, we sleep a little bit earlier and wake up a little bit earlier. Such that you see a huge contrast between teenagers and, grandparents who you must have heard stories or know somebody like that. An older person that sleeps at 8 p.m. awakens very, very early in the morning, and they're very bored in the morning because there's no one to talk to. So when you expose yourself to bright light, it's one method to shift your sleep and your internal body clock earlier. And if you do so on a regular basis, at the same time in the morning when you wake up, it only stabilizes your internal body clock, and that's going to buttress your mood, reduce your risk of depression. So it can't hurt you.
So if you expose yourself to light in the morning, you'll get sleepier earlier in the evening?
Yes. Exposure to blue light of 10,000 lux brightness in the morning will shift their sleepiness and wake time earlier. But if you do so on a regular basis, like let's say every single night for months on end, it's not going to perpetually shift your internal body clock earlier. It'll just do so up to a certain point, after which it's going to remain stable.
Okay. And it might put you in a better mood for the day.
Absolutely.
All right.
And you mentioned, light. That light exposure is influenced by geography and cloud cover. If you are from an equatorial country, that is less of an issue. If you're from a country that's far north of the equator or far south of the equator, there will be periods of time in your winter behind us to be covered. In which case, you can preemptively have this light exposure in the morning as a means to reduce any negative impacts to your nighttime sleep due to cloud cover and lack of light exposure in the morning.
Got it. We'll talk more about light therapy when it comes to shift work, but that's good to know that light therapy might have benefits even if you don't have problems with sleep. Let's talk about light and darkness when you're getting ready for sleep and when you actually go to sleep. So we already talked about how we want to have less bright lights before we go to sleep, and we want more yellow or lower Kelvin lights before we go to sleep. Then my understanding is that when you are asleep, that you want it as dark as possible. And then we'll get to this when we get to the shift work as well, is that if we're working a night shift and we have to sleep during the day, it's going to be key to make the room as dark as possible. What's your recommendation in general about light and dark just before sleep and during sleep?
You're going to want to avoid light with high brightness and lights that tend to be more cold or blue, as you mentioned, in terms of like higher numbers of kelvins. If you expose yourself to that kind of light, you'll actually delay the onset of your melatonin, right, which regulates the timing of your sleep and sleepiness and when you want to wake, etc. Because then that light is it becomes a substitute for what your melatonin receptors, your eyes thinks is sunlight. So if it receives that kind of light, your brain's thinking, well, it's daytime, so I need to stay alert. So close to bedtime, we would say 3 to 4 hours before your intended bedtime, you're going to want to avoid that kind of light. If you have to have light, have it more yellowish light. And it's just best practice if you want the perfect sleep, just to not have lights on when you go to bed, and certainly no lighting once you've initiated and fallen asleep. Again, work done by you're like the world leaders in circadian research. Work done at Harvard, but also Northwestern University in Chicago. They've found that even if your eyelids are closed, that not closing your blinds delivers sufficient lighting that penetrates your eyelids, that it screws up the quality of your sleep at night, and will shorten your sleep duration, increase arousals from sleep. You get more awakenings from sleep. So keeping your sleeping quarters cool, dark, and quiet one of the best suggestions.
Okay, in terms of keeping it dark, I guess there's all kinds of window dressings you can put to try and block it out. I myself have been using Manta, I think it's called, a Manta Eye Shield, which are very comfortable. I've been using for years, and they're really good at blocking out the light. I don't receive any money from Manta. I usually suggest to your patients and clients in terms of making it as dark as possible.
Whatever works is great, right? You know, some people are going to be more comfortable with, like, or their homes may already have blackout blinds installed. And then sometimes that's not necessarily still part of your environment that you can change, right? Depending on where your sleep domicile is. In that instance, you know, other patients they'll wear eye shields, right? Like, you know, just like the things that you wear over your eyes with some sort of elastic in the back. And as long as you're not receiving any light stimuli, you're good.
Okay, great. Very closely related to light are screens. And many of us, I'm sure, are guilty of looking at our phones or our iPads or our computers right until just before we go to sleep. And my understanding is that there is a significant amount of blue light that's emitted from computer screens. What's the recommendation in terms of screen use and in terms of when to stop using them? I understand that there's apps you can put on your computer. I use one called iFlux at 8 p.m. It just takes away all that blue light and it turns it into sort of yellower light. And sometimes I'll decrease the brightness as well on my computer if I need to do work within 2 or 3 hours before I go to sleep. What's the recommendation in terms of screens before sleep?
Yeah, I think doing what you've spoken of, like in your own experience, I think that's going to be fine for, let's say, a person who doesn't have a sensitivity to like sleep issues. If we're talking about a person that's working and doesn't have insomnia disorder, doesn't have any other sleep disorder that's going to make it hard for them to sleep at night, I think what is totally acceptable. If we're talking about a person who's very, very sensitive to sleep disturbance, you know, a person that's had multiple episodes of insomnia disorders throughout your lifetime, I would say if you're really interested in having perfect sleep, then for the 3 to 4 hours before your intended bedtime, then you just avoid light exposure in general. And that's going to include your smartphone, any sort of tablets, television, any form of artificial light. That's the recipe for people who have a sensitivity to sleep issues.
Okay, and for those of us who do like to read before sleep, and it actually helps us relax, I understand that I don't have money and Amazon and Kindle, but I understand that Kindle does not emit blue light, whereas an iPad does.
I wish I knew more about like the different e-readers and specifications and let's see for like tablets. But anything that is less bright is probably better compared to whatever you use as computer lighting. I'm thinking just in personal experience, if I'm using an iPad, like they do get pretty bright anytime if you're using it outside. In contrast, if you're dealing with like those e-ink readers and even the ones that are backlit are just not very bright at all, using those compared to like the very bright LCD or LED screens, that's going to be better for your sleep.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think about the people who like to read before sleep. If you're going to use a bedside lamp, make sure it's not very bright and that it has low kelvins, so it's more of a yellow light. If you prefer paper books, if you prefer a screen, get an e-reader that emits as little light as possible, as blue light as possible, and my understanding is that Kindle is a good choice in that regard. Just a quick word from one of our sponsors, the Rural Ultrasound Fellowship. Hey, focus fans, ever consider an ultrasound fellowship? In just 1 year, go from solid focus user to full-on expert. No career pause, no travel required. The RUF's world-class faculty has trained over 40 ER docs in rural communities and around the globe. Fully online, fully flexible, with a 97% completion rate, it really works. Re-energize your practice. Boost your confidence. Visit ruralultrasound.com to learn more. That's RURAL ultrasound.com. I want to talk a little bit more about sleep environment. You mentioned this, but there's noise and temperature. Use earplugs in your sleep, especially if I'm sleeping during the day when other people in my household are up. I use earplugs to try and block out the noise. And then check the temperature. Understanding that you want to sleep lower temperature than temperature. What do you recommend in terms of noise and temperature?
Regarding noise, you want to keep that from noise is one reason why people have to wake up, right? And that's rooted in survival. So it's evolutionary means to live as long as possible, as healthy as possible. Right? Like a person must wake up to noise, a person must wake up to urinary movements. In most cases, it's healthy, pain. So you're going to want to keep noise and sounds to a minimum. And you mentioned earplugs as one technology to do so. Find it easy to fall asleep with a white noise machine. Now, is that the majority of the world in the world? Probably. But if it works for you, then you sleep or even fall asleep quicker and sustain sleep for longer with the presence of a white noise machine, so be it. But I think for most people, they would sleep better with no white noise machine or anything that creates sounds. About temperature, this is why this study. There are optimal temperatures for sleep, and they bias against and away from high temperatures. So, cool, dark, and quiet being the optimal sleep environment. People say 20 degrees Celsius is a great temperature to initiate systems. If you get too cold, it's too hot. It's not something that we're talking about today, but it's a concern for us that study sleep medicine. Climate change and increase in temperatures around the world might insomnia and other sorts of things. Interesting. So you want your room to be below 20 degrees. 20 is good. When you fall asleep, and then during your sleep, you want it to be also below 20 degrees. What about for waking up? I don't think we need to change temperatures. I think around 20 degrees is okay. Dream sleep, you enter a quite lethargic state. So you actually, in dream sleep, it doesn't regulate its temperature like it does in REM sleep. So in the morning, people actually feel quite cold. Unless you have sleep apnea, it's quite cold if it's cold. And in REM sleep, people get lost and you stop breathing. Fight or flight hormones are activated, so you might actually wake up with some sweat and feel kind of warm. But that's a pathological condition. Most of us wake up feeling kind of cold. Okay. So 20 degrees is a good sleep temperature, but you don't want it to be too cold because then you'll have difficulty with sleep. Okay, great. And just for our U.S. listeners out there who are still using Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, I believe it's Fahrenheit. All right. What about alarm clocks? You mentioned you're the top of that. I feel like I wake up to sleep. Alarm clock. That's emitting light. Sleeping. I understand. Charger can be and then they'll turn the on. After dark, you should never check the time at night. That might just make you anxious and sleep again. What's your take on alarm clocks and iPhones and checking times? Yeah, so first off, whether it's a phone or an alarm clock in your sleep, you don't get to have check it to rooms and sleep because everything does the same thing. You'll look at the time and you're going to do some math. You're going to figure out how much time in itself. It's not conducive to sleep. It's conducive to insomnia. So hence we ask people to set an alarm for their consistent daily wake time, after which you don't check the clock. Even if you wake up in the middle of the night, you have to use the bathroom, hopefully you're able to do so without turning on a light. And then you're going to go back, not knowing what time it is. Because let's pretend it's like this. You woke up at 5:30 and your alarm time is 6. At 5:30, if you have blackout blinds, you might not even know that it's only half an hour to your wake time, in which case you can use your bathroom, go back, and you can squeeze out the maximum amount of sleep that you can. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you checked. It's a good example. You mentioned waking up in the middle of the night. What should we do if we do wake up in the middle of the night? I've heard things like counting sheep, which doesn't really work. I've heard things like, well, if you really can't fall asleep, you should actually go into another room and do something different that's relaxing for 10, 15 minutes and then come back. What's your recommendation for people who wake up in the middle of the night and are having trouble getting back to sleep? Yeah, we actually have a very evidence-based intervention for that kind of, specifically for this kind of situation. It's part and parcel of the gold standard treatment for insomnia disorder, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy. So in this particular type of therapy, there's something that's called stimulus control. They tell you what to do exactly in this situation. If you wake up in the middle of the night and it feels like it's been a long time, again, right, you're not checking, it just feels like it's been a long time, so go back to sleep. It's best that you leave your bedroom, go to a different room that's dimly lit, and do some input. until you feel that head on you feel it. And then that's the beginning of your bedroom. When I say deeply boring in that dimly lit room, what is we tell people to do something like the word search? Letters and jumbled up words that look forward, you're going to circle them, whether it's horizontally or vertically or diagonally. The reason why we ask people to do that is all the questions are on the page, so you're not going to get riled up like you go to a crossword puzzle and you invariably solve. You can't do math. Math is universally annoying, at least annoying to the point where it causes more mental activity. So people want to do Sudoku. Some people, do a word search in a dimly lit room inside your bedroom, and then go back when you feel sleepy. So you're breaking the association between sleep and that's the concept of conditioning. Sleep is conditioning. If you're wide awake and you're trying to fall back asleep and you're all the time, night to night, after that, your brain thinks it's normal to do that. So this breaks that cycle and also allows you to feel the signs and head on. And as you become more sensitive to those signs, you're better able to have better sleep.
All right, so just to kind of summarize the basic sleep hygiene stuff, before sleep, no screen until 12 hours before sleep. If you can help it, no alcohol for 3 hours before sleep, no big meals for 3 hours before sleep. During sleep, you want to keep the temperature in your bedroom 20 degrees or even a little less. Use earplugs to block out any noise or a white noise machine. The earplugs don't work for you. Keep your room dark or wear eye shield during sleep. And when you wake up, you want to wake up to nice bright light, blue daylight. And if you don't have any blue daylight, then you might want to try an